we go. Again, third year York University student. So I've said that like 10 times, but here we go. And I play for the women's football team. It's kind of like a team club here. And I also am really interested in computer science. So I actually just got back from Silicon Valley to check out a school there and learn about the industry a little bit more. And that was through LHAGS, which was an event at York University. And so I heard about it through that, and I applied, and it was really exciting. So that's what I've been up to recently. I'm also an artist, so I do watercolor as well, and I do poetry. And I just got actually two of my poems published in a literary magazine called Montreal Writes. So I'm really interested in publishing and just putting meaning into what I do. And I don't really like to do things unless there's meaning behind it or a purpose for it. And I'm also a guest speaker at Humber College, so every semester I lecture in an animal behavior class, and my dog's name is Kobe, and so I'm very interested in animal behavior and training dogs, and I do a lot of trick competitions with him. So actually this weekend we're going and doing a trick competition at a festival called Woofstock. So last year we placed second, and this year hopefully first. We'll see. So I am going to risk this right now and try to see if this will work. We'll see. So what is the problem of evil, and why is it a problem? So let me just start here. So it originated with the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And it's kind of the idea that if God is really all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, why does evil exist? And in more detail, if God is really all-knowing, wouldn't he know about evil? And if he's all-loving, wouldn't he want to prevent us from feeling the negative effects of evil? And, I just want to make sure this isn't going to change. And if he's all-powerful, he would be able to prevent evil. So based on those three things, why does evil still exist in this world? Why is there suffering? Why is there pain? And so Mackie, which is a philosopher, and really tries to tackle the problem of evil, and he kind of uses it as a reason for why God doesn't exist. So he kind of says if God exists, he can only contain two of these three properties. So he's either unwilling or unable to prevent evil. So if he's unwilling to prevent evil, then how can he be all-loving? Because if he's able to prevent it, but he's still allowing people to suffer, then that's not a very loving act. And maybe if he's unable to prevent it, then he's not really all-powerful or all-knowing. So he's challenging the way that we see God in a lot of these monotheist religions that say that God has all these properties. More on that later. Now, Swinburne is another person that kind of tackles this problem from a similar perspective, except he says that God is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, but with one limitation, that God is all-knowing, but he doesn't have foreknowledge, so he can't see the future acts of a free agent. So kind of the idea is if we do something, we make a decision, then if it's determined, he's saying that God has already made it a possibility, and so we don't have free agency if that's the case. Because if God can see the future, then how are we choosing moment by moment? Now, I'm not going to get into determinism really in this talk, but this is kind of his argument, that if God can see the future, that he's already created it for us. And if he already created it for us, then we can't be free agents because we haven't actually made the choice yet. So that's kind of what he's saying. So he's saying, but God can't know our acts in the future, because otherwise they would already exist and he would have already determined them. Now, I don't agree with that. There's obviously different views. Like you could say that determinism exists, and it doesn't matter if we're going to make the choice, we're going to make the choice. and that doesn't infringe on free will. So there's views on that. I'm not going to get into too much, but there's very different ways to approach that. And so Swinburne basically says that God is unable to interfere with free will because he doesn't contain foreknowledge. Now this is kind of my response. So that's a problem, because if God doesn't have foreknowledge of what we're doing, and then how can he be all-knowing? It's kind of hard to say he's all-knowing, but I mean, it's kind of, he's either all-knowing or he's not, and he can't be all-knowing if he doesn't know the future. And the other problem is he can't really be all-powerful, because he'd have to be able to change the future if he was all-powerful. And so Swinburne, despite how he words it, is really kind of arguing that God isn't all-knowing and isn't all-powerful. And the problem with this is that it conflicts with the major monotheistic religions. So like in many holy texts, there's a lot of prophecies. And if God can't know the future, how can he do these prophecies? And another part of this is that Swinburne is a philosophy of Christian religion professor at Oxford University. So that's why I think that it's really interesting that his views conflict with these prophecies in the holy text that he's talking about in his classes. So I'm not really sure how it's logically consistent that he's both, that God cannot see the future, and also that these holy texts are true. So it's kind of hard to see how he would reconcile those two things in a class. And obviously holy text, isn't proof in itself or anything like that. But I mean, the fact that he is trying to argue for God through this viewpoint, I think, is where the logical inconsistencies occur. And so basically believing in holy text, which includes God's ability to see what will happen, and believing that we have free will due to God's lack of future vision, is a logical contradiction. And again, this is only because he's arguing for God through the context of Christianity, where it becomes a logical contradiction there. So then, how should we reconcile the problem of evil with free will? So why would God allow for evil in the world? And I basically said that because free will doesn't exist because God is limited, but because he wants us to have free will. So this kind of comes to the meat of my talk, which is kind of why evil can exist alongside an all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing God. How they can logically coexist, so that God can be loving and still allow for evil, that he can be all-powerful, have a way to change evil and eradicate it, and how he's all-knowing, he knows about evil, but chooses to leave it. So we're going to get into that now. So I'm going to go through the idea that freedom relies on evil. So Mackie says, first guy we brought up here, that says that God can only be two of the three attributes. So he can either be all-knowing, all-loving, or all-powerful. He can only be two of those three things. So that's this guy. And he also says something else. He says God could logically allow people to choose good on every occasion. Since evil exists, he's either unable or unwilling to do this. So it's kind of the idea that if I can choose to do a good thing, why can't I choose to do a good thing every time? So if I wanted to help my neighbor, why couldn't every time I choose to help someone? Why do I have to choose to be bad at all? And what's interesting about this is Kant, who I'm going to get into as well, says it's impossible for this to happen because of our human nature, the way that we're built, that we're not able to choose good all the time because it's just not in us. We're not, there's no one that has ever succeeded, to our knowledge, to only choose good. And because of this, it's not possible. That's what he argues. And so we're going to get a little bit more into him as well. So Kant says that freedom doesn't exist unless there's a choice between evil and good. So if you can't choose evil or you can't choose good, then you're not free. And if you're a good or bad person, it depends on how often you choose evil or you choose good. So not only does it have moral implications, so if you can't choose evil or you can't choose good, how can you be morally accountable? If I don't have a choice, if I'm forced to do evil, like if I have a good example our professor used last semester is if you have a gun to your head and you're supposed to rob a store, and you're robbing it for the person that has the gun to your head. So you're not benefiting directly yourself, because when you steal all the computers or whatever, when you have this gun to your head, you're not gaining anything out of it. You're giving the computers over. The only thing you're really benefiting from is that you're not going to die. So, and the idea of death for Kant is worse than well, this is how he explained it, is worse than stealing, because you're not benefiting from those stolen goods. So that's a problem in a way in Kant's moral philosophy, because he says, that you should always try to do good. But then when the problem is when there's two evils, how do you choose the lesser evil? How do you do, in that situation, it's worse to die than it is to steal. And so how often you choose. And then the other thing is freedom. So again, if you're not free if you don't have those choices, and that's what Kant says. So to go back to Mackie, first of all, Kant would say it's impossible to choose good on every occasion. You're not free, and you have no moral development if you follow this Mackie's viewpoint there. So how does free will relate to our search for God? So according to John Hick, if people come to the realization, and this is a quote, that God is the infinite divine being in glory, goodness, and love, then they would no longer have free will. So he argues that God has to hide himself in society in his true nature in order so that free will can be preserved. Because the problem is, if God is so obvious, and it's obvious that he's the creator, and that he's love and everything, and he encompasses everything, then it would be really hard to ignore that. So in the example with the flat earth earlier, if it was so obvious that the world was round, like it is, then you'd have to be an idiot to just say it's flat. And it's like with God. If God was so obvious in society, then John Hick argues, it would infringe on our free will, because we could not seek God on our own volition. We would only be seeking him. It would be biased, because it would be so obvious who he was. And you'd be a fool not to acknowledge that, and you wouldn't be able to choose other religions. You wouldn't be able to be an atheist or agnostic. You wouldn't really have that spiritual search. You'd be missing out on a lot of that and finding yourself, because it would be so obvious. And so he says that would affect free will, which is why God to him is not evident and obvious in the world as a specific entity. Like a specific religion or a specific viewpoint is not obvious to the majority of society. As we know, we're so divided. So. And Swinburne says something similar to Hick. So he says that if God revealed everything verbally, from the true nature of reality to the purpose of evil, this revelation would tamper with free will. So if you had verbal guidance from a specific God, and the example I gave in my paper is if you had a radio that was definitely from God, some kind of radio or sound system, and everyone had one, and everyone admitted and acknowledged that it was God broadcasting all these truths and theories for your benefit, and telling you this is why evil exists, and this is the true nature, and telling you black and white how things are, then it would be really hard to deny God's existence. And again, that would hinder your ability to seek God and your beliefs on your own volition. So that's the other thing. And then my argument too is if God told us in black and white how things were, why evil exists, all these different things, but then still gave us this nature that Kant said that we can't help but choose evil, we can't help but doing bad things from time to time. Well, that's kind of unfair, if you know definitively what evil is, what it will do to you, all these horrible things, but then you have this nature that God also gave to you that makes you choose them anyway, even though he's been telling you not to. So basically, any sort of verbal guidance or evidence, according to Hick and Swinburne, would affect the search for God and free will. And I feel like that would also trickle down to all the rest of our, the ways that we act as well, and affect free will in other areas. So let's say God gives us verbal guidance and tells us to be a moral person. Well, that would affect our relationships with friends and family. That would affect the way we act in school, like academic honesty and honesty at work. Like it would kind of do a 360 for the world, which, it sounds great, but we wouldn't have that free agency again to choose bad, which is what Kant says is required for freedom. So it's kind of trading in these hardships and spiritual growth and moral responsibility for more of a synthetic world where you're forced to choose good without really having, we'd have the same nature that we have now where we can't choose good all the time. So it would be like you're trapped in this body where you want to do good, but your nature is fighting against it. So Swinburne also goes into morals in this way as well. So if we can't decide our own morals through life experience, he says that we can't be morally free agents. So if we can't learn from trial and error, then how can we be morally free? If we're influenced by all sorts of things, like if we're influenced by God verbally telling us, or God showing himself as, strong evidence in the world, or some strong influence, then how are we morally free agents? We can't be, because we are being coerced and forced into something else. So Kant, that was another thing he says in his Ethics, is that you cannot be a morally free agent if you're coerced or tricked into something. So if someone gives you a false promise, so if they say, if you clean the driveway, if you rake the driveway, I will do the dishes. So you agree to that because you assume that the person is promising what they're promising, that they will do the dishes if you rake the driveway. So you rake the driveway because you know the person will do the dishes. But then you rake the driveway and they don't do the dishes. And so you've done something with a false promise. And you may not have raked the driveway if you knew they weren't going to do the dishes. So you weren't able to make an informed decision. So that's another part of it too. And coercion is the other side of the coin that Kant mentions in his Ethics. And if you're being coerced into something, so the idea of an offer you can't refuse. So an example is in Singer. He talks about like poverty-stricken nations, how a lot of these people come in and offer food or supplies of some sort in exchange for a nuclear power plant or some sort of military base being built in a poverty-stricken area. And because these people are starving and vulnerable, they agree to anything because they're very hungry. So it's taking advantage. Because if you refuse that, you die, but you wouldn't accept it if you weren't in a position of disadvantage. So all these things Kant argues hinder being able to choose as free agents. So Swinburne and Hick are kind of saying that if we had God, if we had this influence, that would also affect free agency as well. Because it would almost be like coercion in a way, because you're not able to believe what you want to believe, because it's the information is just so it's presented so perfectly to you that it affects everything in your life, and that's not really free will. And Hick takes it a step further with the idea of he says that a world without problems, difficulties, perils, and hardships would be morally static. For moral and spiritual growth, through response to challenges, and in a paradise there would be no challenges. So he's arguing that if God does remove evil, if he takes evil out of the equation, that there would be no challenges, because everything would be perfect, there would be no pain, but there would be no growth, and there would be no freedom, as Kant would say, because you're never growing, you're never learning through hardship, you're never really having to make the wrong choice. You're just kind of going through your life, you're like you're a robot and doing the right thing all the time and not really getting anywhere other than just living and existing. And Swinburne and Hick don't think that is a great place to live, and I really don't think so either, because there's something really valuable you can learn from hardship. So the way I see it is God has two options. So if it's an all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful God, and he really is able to see evil, he's able to see future, present, past evil, he's able to change anything because he's all-powerful within the logical limits, and he's all-loving, so he wants the best for people. So that's kind of the picture of major monotheistic religions. You kind of have this God that can prophesize, that's powerful, that's made the world, that is all loving, wants the best for people. So this is kind of a, going off these monotheist religions, which is what Swinburne's involved in as a Christian religious scholar. So if God is really this way, and let's just assume he is for the sake of this argument, so he has two options. He can remove evil. So he can just get rid of evil entirely, make us kind of like robots, where we're just, like I said, moving through our lives, making the world morally stagnant, according to Hick, and forcing us to recognize God as the ultimate good and worship him, and just kind of going through the motions of this. And removing freedom, because we can only choose good. We won't have the option to choose evil. We can only choose good. So we don't have freedom. We don't really grow. We're stagnant. We're just basically living our lives. So that was the first option. The second option is to make it useful. So to leave evil in the world, to use it to teach life lessons, as Hick says, to give us the option to reject God if we want. But we don't have to worship him. We have the option to reject everything and still, have free will. And it also allows for free will. So I like to say that a simple way to picture God alongside free will. So a way to kind of sum this up and make it kind of easy to understand in a nutshell is God is like a future teller, and that he does not change the future, but instead judges it as an observer. So like a fortune teller, they're able to see it, and they're not able to change it. But in my argument, he's able to change it, but he chooses to just observe it and see it. And he's all loving, and he gave evil a purpose, so for growth and free will, as Kant and Hick and Swinburne argue. And he's all-knowing, which explains why he can see the future. So Swinburne's argument kind of fails there, because it doesn't mesh with many of the holy texts, which Swinburne also argues for. So I think that's, a more, for monotheists, that's more of a consistent theory. And even though he's all-powerful and could change the future, he chooses not to in order to preserve free will. So I think that's a really concise way to look at it. So he can be all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, and allow evil to exist without having any logical contradictions or without removing free will. So I guess this is something to consider going forward and just kind of summing things up. Would you rather live in a world which evil didn't exist, but you're forced to worship God, had no freedom, and never grew morally? So you're basically like a robot. Or the world we currently inhabit. For me, I would rather live in the world that we currently inhabit, because you can grow, you can learn, and you can choose things for yourself. And I think that that's a huge part of humanity, being able to learn from our mistakes and to learn from each other and to grow from each other. And if we don't have that, then that's a huge part of humanity. I don't even know what that would look like in a world that didn't have this. It's so human to us to be able to grow and make mistakes. And as Kant says, it's built into our nature to make mistakes and to learn and to have this freedom and sense of free agency. And without that, we'd lose our humanness. We'd just be like robots going through life. And that's Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
So I'm just wondering, you talked a lot about how, having free will is part of this process, but God, if he's made our world, he's already placed limitations on our free will in order to choose good. Like if I have a free hour, I say I'd like to teleport myself to Africa to help children for an hour. I'm not able to do that because of the limitations he's placed on me, and yet he's created a world in which there's no limitations around, say, torturing a child. That's still within the scope of something that can happen. So why wouldn't God create a world in which there's no capacity for us to be able to commit certain types of evil? And conversely, if you want to allow that, why wouldn't he allow us complete total freedom in choosing good?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, with teleporting and stuff, I think it's a lack of knowledge. Like, who knows, maybe one day we'll get to that point and be able to have more and more openness on free will, because I feel like every year we have more and more options. Like hundreds of years ago, I couldn't say I'm gonna go fly somewhere, go get on a plane and be in LA in a couple hours. I mean, so I think our options are always expanding, but we're also always losing options as well. So like with the destruction of the environment and different things, we're losing the ability to do certain things that we could do, hundreds of years ago. Like we have different environmental makeups and stuff. So I think we're always kind of losing and gaining more and more options. But I think if you're going to create a world, you kind of have to, at least in terms of the worlds we know, that you have to have some sort of structure, because you have to have some sort of foundation or basis to even have life. Like you need certain conditions for life. You need a framework to kind of exist in. Otherwise it would just be kind of chaos, and we probably wouldn't have the same community that we have as well either, because it would just be kind of all over the place. I don't know. It's a good question though.
If I may, I think if I answered that question in your paper, like the reason why God created us so that we have the capacity to do evil is because he wants to give us a free agency to. If he didn't give us the capacity, then we would always choose a good thing, and we're not really technically free to do so, because we're programmed in a certain way such that we do always do the right thing.
Yeah.
We always avoid the bad thing. So I think in your paper you did say like that the existence of evil is what makes us free agents, and it's our choosing to do good that, according to Kant, makes us good people.
Yeah, and my point was just more like, why place limits on the amount of good you can do and not place limits on the bad, right? I guess it was just kind of why create a world in such a way where you don't have infinite choices for goodness, you have physical limitations. Whereas you could put physical limitations on the bad, but you didn't, right? I guess that was just...
But I don't really know if the bad, I think there's limitations on both. Like if
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I think, I mean, there's limitations on, how much evil you can do. I mean, like you said, torturing a child. I mean, there's only so many things that the human body can handle. I guess it's a little bit morbid, but you know what I mean. Like there's limits on how much you can hurt another person before they they pass out from the pain or they die or whatever. And I mean, I think that if you had an unlimited amounts of good or unlimited amounts of evil, I mean, if you had unlimited, it would be so far. Like you could have someone that was so far removed from. I think that maybe this is a better way of answering it. If you had someone that was just like so evil that there wasn't an ounce of good in their body and they were just able to like nothing like we've seen before, but yet there was someone here on the other side that was like the saint that was perfect, that had never done anything wrong. Like if that was possible for us to always choose good or always choose evil, I think that's one of the main limitations that kind of structures this foundation of the world, that it's like everyone in the world will always choose evil and good at some point in their lives, and I think you really need that. Otherwise, people would be too far apart to really commune together and learn from each other. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
I have a question about the coercion comment that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I'm only raking the leaves because I know someone else is going to wash the dishes, and that's coercion. So
Well, that's false promise, sorry.
False promise?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's two, sorry, I mean, I didn't differentiate too much, but the false promise is kind of when you make a promise that you know is false at the time that you're making it. So if you say, I'm going to wash the dishes just because you want someone to rake, but you know that you're not going to do it as soon as you say that. And then the coercion is more of like when you take advantage of someone that's vulnerable.
I thought, because I was thinking of, for instance, the promises of heaven
Mm-hmm.
and hell.
Mm-hmm.
And do good things and you'll go to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So am I enacting my free will if I'm doing something just because I know the outcome, I was promised an outcome?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I've thought of that before. There's another way people frame it is around like doing good deeds. It's like, can you ever do a good deed selflessly? And I don't think you can. I think that even subconsciously there's always going to be some sort of thing, like if you feel good about yourself, if you help someone, or the people that post on Facebook. Like I had someone that posted once, I bought a homeless person a coffee, and I'm thinking, like, did you do it just so you could write a status about it or what? So I think we're just, if we didn't have that selfish desire to do something for ulterior motives, it's almost like an evolutionary thing. I feel like if it didn't feel good to give to someone else, if you didn't have the promise of heaven, if you didn't have, like, we always have ulterior motives, even subconsciously. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't really move forward. Like, we wouldn't be able to cooperate in the same way if it didn't feel good. Like, if you helped someone and it just felt horrible all the time, you probably wouldn't be motivated to do good. And then, so you kind of need that balance, and I think that that's a huge part of a need for free will and for humanity in general.
So you mentioned the problem of evil and that God must be omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving. And if that's the case,
Benevolent.
then why would we have evil in this world? But the way we conceptualize God is through a, typically Judeo-Christian Christian lens of being this all-loving creature. But I guess if we don't always, like, if we don't satisfy the requirements of, being all-loving, and we only have a God that is all-knowing and all-powerful, and we live in a deterministic world, would that still be logically consistent? I mean, could God just be, all-powerful and all-knowing and willingly impose evil on this world, knowing that it's going to happen?
I guess it could be. I mean, let's see. I guess free will could still, I don't know if free will could really still exist with that, though, because if he's purposefully imposing evil on the world, and he's kind of, would he be in charge of determinism, kind of would he be kind of
Right, yeah.
like pre-planning? Yeah. So then you wouldn't really have the free will as much. And I think that there's such a innate desire in humans, just that we have this free agency, as someone was mentioning earlier, that it's just like, we have this feeling of free agency, and why would we have this idea about it if there wasn't a possibility? But the other thing too is, if God was really not all loving, and he was just like a cruel, evil being that wanted to torture us, then why would he have good in the world? Like, why would he create good at all? I mean, why just not all evil and just make it, like, torture us for eternity, Why would he have, I mean, I think someone that is vengeful probably wouldn't even bother to create good.
Right. Well, I mean, God could have, I mean, this doesn't really presuppose that God doesn't give both evil and good in the world,
But why would he give good if he just wanted people to be upset?
Because we could be the ones constructing good and evil. God is the one who just creates this thing, and does that really negate the idea that we have the problem of evil if God doesn't, isn't really all loving, but just is this all-powerful, all-knowing being that is pretty much indifferent rather than any sort of moral agent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that he creates us, if he created us in the way that we are, to have the capacity to live. Well, I mean, for me personally, to answer the question I kind of asked you, is I think you need good and evil to contrast the two. So I feel like if a God was, like if it was kind of a indifferent God or whatever, well, I mean, would he be, if he was all loving, if he wasn't all loving, would he just be neutral, or are you saying that he would be kind of more evil? Just like neutral?
Neither really, because it's just, indifferent. It's
indifferent, yeah.
It's just something we entirely create. I'm kind of just playing.
But he would, yeah, that's a good point, though. But I think he had to create the capacity for us to understand good and evil. Like, even if he didn't create evil, he'd have to create some kind of faculties in us to be able to even create the idea of good and evil if he didn't create it. And, all these things that he created, and being able to feel and being able to give purpose, like, why would he do that if he didn't care? I mean, maybe we evolved into it, but, I mean, he would have to create kind of the starting foundation, or, maybe he'd want to dabble in the world and change things, and how would he, if he was indifferent, how would he even decide on a world? They're all that's an interesting thing to think about, so.
Just continuation of this is, how would you even define a good God versus evil God?
I would say like intention. So I mean, if all loving, usually in Judeo-Christian kind of monotheistic popular religions, is that he wants the best for us, that he motivates us to do good, like do not do this, do not do bad, love people, stuff like that. So I think maybe the intention behind.
Yeah, but just an example, if the God is sadistic and due to some unforeseen, whatever, a little bit of good arises in this universe, he might just say, well, doesn't matter, 90% of it is evil, so that's good enough.
Yeah.
Which kind of reflects our universe, really.
That's true, but I think that there's a potential to have like a really good life. Like, even though maybe most people's lives aren't really good, but to be able to live your life with a really positive mindset your whole life, and just, really positive people and saints and stuff. Like, I don't think I think a sadistic God would see that and say, no, I'm gonna interfere with this person. They're too happy or whatever. I think he would make it impossible for people to really be happy long term. Period.
Well, I'm not like a Christian or anything, but like from what I've like kind of read about the all loving concept is more so that like even if you sin or even if you are flawed, God will still love you. It's not necessarily like He wants all of us to be happy and like run around and rainbows all the time. So it's more of like a salvation than it is like a God is kind of I guess breeding us to be these like happy creatures. So I guess that's where
Yeah.
we do a free will debate because in that sense, even if you do make a mistake or you do sin or whatever, then God's still there or whatnot.
That's a good point. I kind of see it in a way like, God is all powerful, all loving, and all knowing. And we kind of are created to fall short of that. So we can't match any of those three things because otherwise God would be creating other gods. So we have that limitations on love and therefore good and evil. So evil exists. So maybe God has all those attributes, but we can never be all good because we can never reach that level of God. Like He's not going to create the other gods, so He created us less than in all three of those categories. But I think I think He had to create some sort of limitation on the being able to do good. So even though I think that's a good point. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I never thought about it that way, like an all-loving God being like, He would still love you despite sins and stuff. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Secondly, perhaps maybe to address the all-loving sense in the previously of like a God that wants the best for us, maybe we can preserve all three properties if we think about an all-loving God doesn't necessarily prevent us from doing bad, in the same kind of sense that as a parent you wouldn't prevent your child from doing everything bad. We don't tell. I hope we don't tell our children that you have to be this way and this is the way you have to be perfect. Because if we did that, we would be robbing them of agency and what they can learn from it. And an all-loving God can still maybe have room for the existence of evil if we think of Him as not trying to inflict it on us, but one, for us to contrast it, and also two, can we even really logically conceive of an all-good world without the contrast? Like, what would an all-good world even be like if we had no concept of evil? Right?
Yeah.
So I think in that way, maybe we can accommodate the existence of evil and still preserve all three properties.
That's a really good point, because someone had told me once that they saw sin as or sin or doing evil, I mean, in a religious context, as is God's not trying to put us in this box and saying, I want you this way, I want you not to do this and this and this and this, but it's because it's for our benefit. If we're stealing, if we're fighting, if we're killing each other, then that's not really a world that we really want to live in. If everyone's stealing from each other, all these commandments and stuff, it's not because He wants us to be perfect and He's annoyed, oh gosh, these humans. It's because He knows that He built us. This is how we flourish the best. But at the same time, we're not always able to choose good, like you said. So if we mess up, we can learn. And if we do good, then we improve the world, kind of thing. So I like that point. Yeah, question.
Yeah, I just had a comment. I want to ask you this. It's a question. Do you believe the concept of human, good and evil, is a human concept that applies only to humans? The reason why I say so is because if there is an all-loving God or all-knowing God, right, all-powerful God that created all the universe, right? Look where humanity stands in that universe. We're so small compared to the massive size of the universe.
Yeah.
Who's to say that God would create a concept solely for this one specific species? Does it not apply? Does good and evil apply to plants, animals, rocks, dust, tiny particles, and leaves, then how do we even know if God created with the intention of having good and evil, if it's something that solely applies to just humans?
That's an interesting point, because we studied that in ethics actually last semester about the idea of animals. Like, there's actually kind of two arguments that animals have ethics and they have more the capacity for morality, and that they don't. And so the idea was like, if a lion killed a baby zebra in front of the mother, and he was hungry, he had to eat, and he didn't think, that poor mother. But how do we really know that that's true? Because if we're in a society where we're starving, I mean, there's people that have done all sorts of really horrific things to provide for their family. So who knows? What if the lion cubs were about to die, and you see it as, oh, this horrible lion killing this baby zebra? Well, maybe he thought about it for a week, and then, I mean, we don't really know. I mean, who knows? I mean, as abstract and ridiculous as that sounds, I really have a hard time when people try to project the thoughts of animals, where it's like, how do we really know what's going on in their head? Like, we can't even really measure our own consciousness. So how can we, ask about the morals of an animal? And I also think that because God created like pain and suffering, emotional and physical, in other species, in animals and in plants, they're coming up with studies where, like, there's a scientist, his last name's Emoto, and he did a study on water, actually, and he yelled at one jar of water and wrote like negative things on it and said loving things to the other, and they froze it. And looking, and the molecules looked different under the microscope, and they've done similar things with plants. So it's really interesting, I feel, and even in quantum physics and stuff, there's a whole bunch of different theories coming out on the Higgs boson. I never know how to say that properly. The God particle and stuff like that, and the double slit experiment. Like, there's a whole bunch of different things with that. So I don't think we really can know, at least at this point. Oh.
Last question.
Okay.
For the sake of time, sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, when I think about God, sometimes I think maybe God is just trying to learn something from us. Like, like, if I was going to create something, I think it would be nice for it to have some unknown, or perhaps like when people do experiments, or like, I just want, curious what will happen. Because like a lot of people say, like, why would God design it like this or that? But like maybe he or she or whatever didn't know, and just like observing it.
Yeah, I've heard that theory too. It's really interesting. I've even heard theories where God goes to different planets and does different kind of experiments and sees how it plays out. So I mean, I think that's pretty interesting. And I mean, who knows, right? You can't really say either way. We can only theorize about these things. So.